1. And the Lord spake. Again, as if the matter were only now begun, God demands of Pharaoh his own peculiar right, viz., that his people should serve him, but out of the land of Egypt, that his worship might be separate and pure from all defilement, for he desired, as was before said, by this separation of his people to condemn the superstitions of the Egyptians. Meanwhile there was no excuse for the tyrant, when, with sacrilegious boldness, he presumed to deprive God of his just honor. Therefore, in refusing to let them go, he was declared not only to be cruel, but also a despiser of God. Threatening is also added, that at least he may, however unwillingly, be driven to obey, for thus must the stubborn be dealt with, who never are brought to duty except when forced by fear or punishment. Indeed, God sometimes also threatens his own servants, in order to stimulate their laziness, but especially is he more severe towards the perverse and disobedient. Thus is it said, Psalm 18:26. With the pure thou wilt show thyself pure, and with the froward thou wilt show thyself froward. This is the reason why he sanctions his command with threats. 92, when he addresses Pharaoh. In this second plague there are, besides, two things to be remarked by us, for, first, God shows that the Egyptians had hitherto held their lives by a precarious tenure, as it were, because he had protected them from the incursion of frogs by his special mercy. We know that Egypt, on account of its many marshes, and the sluggish and almost stagnant Nile, was full of frogs and venomous animals. Now, when great multitudes of them come forth suddenly, cover the surface of the fields, penetrate even to the houses and bedchambers, and finally ascend even into the royal palace, it plainly appears that they were before only restrained by God's hand, and thus that the God of the Hebrews was the guardian and keeper of that kingdom. Secondly, God chose not only to inflict a punishment upon the Egyptians, but to expose them to mockery by its ignominious nature, nor can we doubt but that their pain must have been much embittered by this contumely, when they saw that they were thus evil entreated not by some victorious army, but by filthy reptiles, and besides this, that their calamity had its origin in the Nile, which enriched their country with so many advantages. But let us learn from this history that there are many deaths mixed up with our life, and that it is not otherwise lengthened out to us, except as God restrains the dangers which everywhere beset us. And again, although he may not openly strike us with lightning from heaven, nor arm his angels for the destruction of men, still, at his slightest nod, all creatures are ready to execute his judgments, and, therefore, we must ascribe it to his kindness and long-suffering, if the wicked do not perish at each moment. Finally, if we are ever galled by ignominy or disgrace, let us remember that this happens designedly, that the shame itself may mortify our pride. 5. And the Lord spake unto Moses, say unto Aaron. It is questionable whether God thus enjoined Moses in a continuous address, or whether he waited until Pharaoh contumaciously despised his command. It is probable, indeed, that after Pharaoh had paid no attention to the threats, the execution of the punishment was commanded. Meantime, we must recollect what I before said, that Moses moved not even a finger, but, as he had been commanded, transferred the active measures to his inferior minister, that thus Pharaoh might be treated more contemptuously. It was thus that he overwhelmed the whole land, as it were, by a breath. But although in this way God cast down the fierce tyrant in his swelling pride to be trampled beneath their feet, still the wickedness of the magicians did not rest. Thus was it requisite that the servants of God should be exercised by constant contests one after another. 8. Then Pharaoh called for Moses. Pharaoh at last appears to be softened, and to lay aside some of his fierceness, but it will soon appear that he was not really tamed. It may indeed have been that, seized with terror, he seriously took refuge in cries for pardon, but that he lied to God, and to himself, is plain from his very inconstancy, because, as soon as a reprieve was granted, he returned to his natural disposition, nay, he effectively manifested that his malice was only repressed by fear, since it presently began to vent itself again. Thus do hypocrites, when they are beneath God's afflicting hand, or tremble under the apprehension of his chastenings, humbly and submissively implore his mercy, but when the evil has been withdrawn for a little while, this short truce puffs up their hearts, as if they had attained an eternal peace. The prophet complains in the psalm, that thus also it happened with the Jews. When he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and inquired early after God, and they remembered that God was their rock, and the high God their Redeemer. Nevertheless, they did but flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues, for their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. Psalm 78 hours 34 minutes minus 37. In fine, this is a disease common to all hypocrites, that, having found by experience their frowardness to be destructive to them, they feign penitence for the sake of obtaining pardon, because they cannot escape the judgments of God, but, when they fancy themselves escaped, they hasten back to the same pride, they kick against God, and even wantonly insult him. In a word, it is only their trouble that humbles them, and that only for a short time. But although Pharaoh's fear extorted this from him, that he sought for Moses to entreat for him, and was anxious to appease God, yet was it a token of his deceitful and double mind, that he made it, as it were, a bargain, that the frogs should be taken away before he let the people go. His impiety, therefore, lay concealed in his heart, so long as he thought that he could not defy God with impunity, but, relying confidently on impunity, he manifested his deceit and perfidy. Although it was not with any sincere feeling of repentance that he now humbly speaks of Jehovah by name, yet it shows that the stoutness of his spirit was broken, of which mention was made before, when he inquired in mockery, "Who is the Lord?"